All right. So welcome to Elia's Focus Forward. My name is John Ternako. I'm the Executive Director of the Association, or Managing Director, actually. Sorry, I've changed titles a couple times. And this is the Elia webinar series. We are so happy to have actually one of our board members and in Anu Carnegie-Brown and one of our partners, Raisa McNab, with the ATC, amongst other things. And they're here to talk about, is Britain European? Just a couple of housekeeping measures. This is a webinar. Please, we encourage you to chat, use the chat to communicate with other participants. But for your official questions, we request that you use the Q&A, and we'll be managing that. So without further ado, Raisa, Anu.
Shall we say a few words about ourselves, just to be polite? So I run an LSP company in the UK, and that's my interest, obviously, in this, apart from being an Elia director as well. The company is called Sandberg, and we're registered in the UK, but we have staff in 4 EU countries or 4 European countries. So we felt very much on our skin the whole of the Brexit mess and chaos that happened a few years back. And when I was thinking of, as an area director, when I was thinking about this topic, I wanted to bring something different to our members. And I was thinking, like, what does Elia stand for? What kind of webinars could we have that nobody else has had? And this idea of doing business as a European company, doing business with a European company or as a European company outside of Europe came up. And I thought, there might be something in this. And then the first person who came to my mind as an expert on this topic was, of course, Raisa. Raisa is the CEO of the ATC. So already in that role, she knows a lot about it, but she's also an ex-colleague of mine. So she used to work with me at Sandberg some years ago. And she's also a person who is both a UK citizen and a Finnish citizen. So she's an EU person as well as a UK person. So she knows it from a personal angle as well. So that's why I invited her to be the expert at this webinar.
Thanks, Anu. Yes, so my name is Raisa McNab. I'm CEO at the UK's ATC, Association of Translation Companies. The ATC is a trade association representing language service companies operating in the UK and companies outside the UK with an affiliation to the UK market. So the ATC membership includes 225 language service companies, primarily in the UK, but also outside. Many of our member companies have offices elsewhere as well, like Sandberg, like some of you who've joined us today as well. I'm not just a UK person and an EU person. I am also a victim of Brexit. So my work is in the UK, but for personal Brexit-related reasons, we moved back to Finland 3 years ago now. So I am now working from Finland, from an EU country, remotely to the UK. And I've also got my own limited company here in Finland. So I these days also do linguistic work, mainly English content creation. So I'm also doing cross-border trade with the UK from Finland. So I'm in the same boat as many of you, in more ways than one, of course, in a much smaller scale. But Brexit, obviously, as the ATC CEO, has been on my to-do list for the best part of the last 5 years. It started with huge amounts of question marks around what will Brexit mean to ATC member companies, to their clients, to their suppliers, to their collaborators, and then on a wider European scale, what will it mean for companies doing trade and working with UK companies. So today we're going to talk about business, of course, doing business with the UK after Brexit. And to start with, I wanted to spend a few moments to talk about this idea of is this actually a thing? And then we go into a little bit more detail around the red tape. So the paperwork and the barriers that have gone up, cross-border services, VAT, data protection, and so on. And then we'll talk about challenges and opportunities around movement of people, collaboration, and so on. And then finally round up this, this session with questions around what hasn't changed. So I'll spend about 15, 20 minutes on this introduction. And then we open the chat and the Q&A and also let you speak to share your experiences. We've already seen in the webinar chat that there are several of you who are based outside of the UK, but trading with UK, establishing a base in the UK and so on. And this is, of course, you know, something that we're used to doing in the language services industry. There were no barriers to working with the UK earlier. Those have now gone up, but I would like to take this opportunity today to try and understand and pick out a little bit what that actually means and whether some of those barriers are more in our minds than in reality. So the first thing I wanted to pick out is this idea of, are the barriers that we talk about in connection with Brexit, are they really a thing? And are they really a thing in the language services industry? I know that they are a thing for individual families and individual people. My family's decision to leave the UK and move back to Finland was very much a Brexit motivated one. And I know many other families who've made similar decisions. I also know that the barriers that have gone up in terms of personal reasons to go into UK are there. But in terms of business, like I said, this journey started with these massive question marks that nobody could really resolve. You know, what's going to happen to cross-border trade? What can language service companies do in order to continue trading and working with suppliers and clients outside of the UK, or with suppliers and clients in the UK? So there was a period, quite a long period of uncertainty. And that was due especially because all of the focus in terms of Brexit implications and practicalities was on the sales of goods. So tangible, concrete things moving across borders. So all of the effort went into understanding what will happen to goods. And of course, that conversation is still rumbling on. But very little focus was, or attention was given on services. And this is, of course, what we do in the language services industry. So for the longest of time, we didn't know what's going to happen with VAT, with certain other paperwork related elements, because nobody had the answers. And I think, for me at least, quite a lot of the perceived barriers around Brexit have come from those days. So this idea that there's something massive that is going to hit us, that we don't know how to deal with, that has colored mine, certainly, but I think quite a lot of other people's perceptions around the trade or business in services cross-border with the UK both ways. That's one of the kind of overarching elements that I wanted to mention right at the beginning, that I'm not really sure at this point, a couple of years down the line, that Brexit and the barriers that we thought would go up are actually there to that extent. The other thing that I think colors our conversation around Brexit is this idea that we're used to business barriers being lowered rather than raised. So every year or every couple of years, we've got new countries joining the EU, new trade agreements that make it easier to trade cross borders and globally. We're not used to barriers coming up. So existing easy trade relations being eroded and new obstacles coming up to change the way that we're used to doing business in. And I think that is also a thing. So what's worked previously has now changed, but we haven't really up until very recently been that clear as to what exactly has changed and how what's changed has actually influenced the way that we do business. These are kind of intangible things, of course, but the impact of these intangible perceived barriers, I think, is really important when we talk about Brexit, because those intangible barriers and obstacles have also been there, not just in our minds to know that we do business, ticking the right boxes in the paperwork and so on, but also in our clients' minds. And this is what we saw very clearly in the UK straight after Brexit, that I had member companies coming to me and say, I've got French clients coming to me every day saying, no, I can't trade with you anymore because of Brexit and so on. And that also colored our understanding of the landscape, because we had clients, suppliers being faced with this uncertainty of not knowing what can I do safely, what is allowed, how can I continue to work with these people, my suppliers, my clients in the same way. The ways are not the same, but equally there's been this perceived barrier that's gone up that still hasn't quite lowered all the way. So today, really, we'll have a conversation after my introduction. Anu will hopefully be able to share some of her trials and tribulations as well in running business in multiple European countries through a company headquartered in the UK. But let's now start unpicking some of the actual tangible barriers and red tape that has hit us since Brexit. So with Brexit, of course, the UK left the EU. It is no longer within the EU's free trade area. So there is definitely not just perceived, but real red tape around cross-border services between the UK and the EU, and of course, the rest of the world. One of the question marks that we had for a very long time around Brexit was VAT, right? So what on earth are we going to do with VAT? So for over a year, nobody in the UK, including the authorities, could give us a straight answer. What's going to happen with VAT post-Brexit? Many of these red tape barriers, including with VAT, have now been clarified so that we understand that regardless of what we thought at the beginning, VAT for most of the work that language service companies do cross-border is not a thing, right? So B2B, business to business trade or business in services is not a problem. The UK is outside of the EU. VAT is out of scope both ways. So when I sell services to the UK, to my UK clients, I issue an invoice that says out of scope VAT, and that's fine. My accountant deals with that side. What we did discover through our digging into the VAT and trying to find the answers that nobody else could give us was that actually there is an issue and a barrier with B2C sales of services. B2C, of course, business to consumer, so direct individual consumers. And this is something that kind of hit us completely unexpected because, of course, in the language services industry, we don't typically make a massive difference between sales to companies or sales to individual consumers. We do both. Not every single company does both, but pretty much every company does B2B. Many companies also offer B2C, especially if we think about the business like certification of translations, degree certificates, marriage certificates, and so on. There's a lot of that work going on in the language services industry, and that work is typically B2C. Once you're inside the EU bloc, or once you're inside the UK, that's not a problem. You need to charge VAT. If you do cross-border services, that becomes complicated, because for cross-border services from the UK to the EU, or from the EU to the UK, there is an expectation that you charge VAT based on where the customer resides. So there are now complicated arrangements that we need to put in place, or a company needs to put in place, to enable them to sell B2C translation services to individual consumers outside of their trade bloc. If this is you, if your company sells B2C services cross-border between the EU and the UK, either way, you need to be aware of these B2C VAT specifics, and you need to put in place safeguards to make sure that you follow the right guidelines. If you're interested in that, you can access the ATC's post-Brexit guides, including an update for specifically B2C VAT through the ATC's website under our Brexit lobbying and information repository. So this was one of the things that actually came out of the blue, going like, okay, there's a problem here. How do we need to resolve it? There are now mechanisms to do that. So we know what the answer is, but it's not as easy as it was when the UK was still in the EU bloc. So this is a real trade barrier that has gone up. Data protection. I know I'm a geek. It's one of my hobbies along with Brexit. I'm sad. Data protection, GDPR is also a thing. Data protection and GDPR is a thing, not specifically because of Brexit. There is a UK equivalent now of GDPR, which essentially is the same as the EU GDPR. It's changing a little bit, but the UK is deemed as an adequate country from a GDPR compliance point of view. So from a kind of movement of personal data across the EU and the UK, there is no real barrier. The UK is an adequate country, so you can move data between the EU and the UK as if you were moving the data inside the EU. What Brexit actually did reveal, and again through us collectively as a sector going in and trying to dig out the answers of what are the implications of Brexit to data protection and so on, what that helped reveal, and what work we've also been doing otherwise, is to reveal fairly huge gaps in our understanding of how to apply GDPR, so personal data protection legislation in Europe, to our specific industry and sector. And this is the work that we have been working on together with industry partners. So last year, we had an industry expert panel who looked at all of the gaps in our understanding, who looked at the gaps in our figuring out how to implement GDPR provisions to the complex and multilingual global language services supply chain. We figured out where the issues are, or where the gray areas are, and we now have the answers to most of those issues. Primarily, data protection is a Europe-wide challenge, sector-wide challenge that we're still working on. And primarily the challenges around data protection come from this idea that within the work that we do, so translated documents or documents for translation, there is personal data there that needs to be protected. But we as an industry need to send it outside of the EU and EEA and the UK to wherever. Russia, Thailand, Australia, wherever we need to send it to, and back again. And when that data for translation contains personal data, then that constitutes a risk. Now, GDPR, you obviously need to comply with anyway, regardless of whether you're in the UK or in the EU. It's one of the kind of, fairly boring paperwork things that you just need to have, but it's one of those elements that are really critical for many of your clients. In this industry, traditionally, we have been across the board, the whole industry, too lax for too long around data protection. Data protection obviously is much wider than just personal data. It's also securing and keeping safe the sensitive business data that we translate for our clients. So GDPR, you need to understand what we are working on. You need to understand what content you're translating and what data that content contains. So GDPR, again, is something that we're working on sector-wide, not Brexit related. And you can read more in the report that we did last year as a Translating for Europe workshop. On the EU ATC website, there's guides, and there's also an EU ATC guide around GDPR in the translation supply chain. So if you haven't already addressed these questions, you can take those guides and start working on compliance in your company. But this is also something that I keep an eye on now because of Brexit, because the UK GDPR is changing, the UK regulations are changing. We're going to continue this GDPR project on a Europe-wide scale this year to produce better guidelines and easier to use guidelines if we get the funding. So watch this space. So that's in terms of data protection, VAT, the obvious red tape around cross-border trade. But we've already talked about this kind of perceived barrier, this idea that the UK is no longer in the EU bloc, and then that, of course, also goes to lots of other things. So I want to talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities around Brexit and the UK no longer being in the EU. And primarily, I want to talk about those from the point of view of collaboration and people, both in good and in bad. Our industry is one of the most affected in terms of collaboration and people because we are by default so multinational. We are used to and we need to be able to work cross borders globally because that's the service that we sell. So many industries in the UK, for example, or in the EU, really weren't that much affected from barriers between the UK and EU in terms of movement of people. I mean, obviously, agriculture in the UK is falling to its knees now because we don't have workers from the EU anymore coming in. That's a whole other ball game. But even in the language services industry in the UK and in the EU, we were used to having a Europe-wide pool of people who were moving from one country to the next. And we were able to, for example, recruit freely between the UK and the EU. Now, obviously, there is no longer freedom of movement between the UK and the EU. Many have made personal decisions, like my family, had to choose the country that we need to live in at this point in time. Unfortunate, because I've got dual citizenship now so that we can return back to the UK later on. But many families made a decision to leave and they don't have those mechanisms to come back. So what we have seen in the UK's landscape with UK language service companies is that the pool of people, talented multilingual people that we can hire to work internally at language service companies in the UK is constricting. So the pool of people that you can hire in the UK is much smaller and is not being replenished by new people coming to the UK. So what we at the ATC are now doing together with our member companies and our commercial partners is to understand what mechanisms, what services do we need to offer to language service companies in the UK so that they can continue growing their business, hiring people in the UK as much as they can, if that's what they want to, but then also collaborating across the border with different types of service providers who enable them to hire people outside of the UK in EU countries or globally to continue building their business, even if they can't do that physically in the UK. So we're starting to see much more multinational teams, and the Brexit effect that has that has kind of started is that before Brexit, that movement, that hiring, that recruitment was really much more between the EU, the UK, or within the EU, whilst the UK was still in there. And now there's a barrier outside of the UK. So it doesn't really matter whether you're hiring from the EU or in the EU, or whether you're hiring from anywhere else in the world, it's the same thing. So we're now working with commercial partners who allow our member companies to hire anywhere in the world and to disperse their kind of global workforce. What that means for companies based in the EU, of course, means that they're in a probably better position that they were before the UK left, because there is no longer this movement from the EU through to the UK. So now you in the EU get to have all of those great talented people that are no longer have an obvious route through to the UK, whereas we in the UK are suffering because we no longer are able to bring those great multilingual French and German PMs and whoever else traditionally came through to work in the UK. So there has definitely been a massive shift in this whole kind of movement of people and recruitment of people landscape. And that is a barrier that has meant that the UK is now looking much more globally for their non-UK hiring, and the EU recruitment pool or pool of talent is much more EU based. So these are some of the tangible things that we have already seen. And of course, what's delayed this development in that we're only starting to see it really emerge now is the COVID pandemic, right? Because a lot of companies put their recruitment on hold for 2-3 years, but we're now starting to see those shifts. What we have been able to do is to put in place some mechanisms in the UK that allow us, for example, to continue to bring European interns into the UK. But of course, after that, there's visa barriers and all sorts. What that also means is that because there's less movement of people, and so talent is not moving as freely between the EU and the UK, the opportunities and the value of collaboration between companies is much more precious and valuable than it ever was before. So what I have seen over the past few years is UK-based companies going out and either setting up as an entity, as a business entity in an EU country, and looking actively to collaborate with EU-based companies to ensure that they have an EU base within which to continue to grow their businesses. So many companies have bought language service companies in the EU or set up a base in an EU country. And now, although business, like we've seen already, B2B business, there are virtually no major barriers there. I think this has got probably more to do with the perceived barriers that have gone up since Brexit. So many UK companies have wanted to go into the EU and have an EU entity to present to their EU clients, European clients, as a European entity rather than a UK entity behind a perceived Brexit business wall. And this, to me, in a way, is a positive development of Brexit, because the more collaboration we have between language service companies, many of whom are still very firmly in the SME bracket, the more opportunities we're able to create for this kind of cross-border trade and collaboration. And equally, already today, we've got people here joining us. I'd like to hear from your experiences, who've got a base headquarters in the EU and who are looking to establish in the UK. What your experiences are on this kind of perceived barrier, with the UK being outside of the EU now. So that's along the sides of collaboration and people, some real tangible, concrete barriers that are hampering us from continuing on our kind of multinational building of our sector. But then equally, over the past year, certainly new mechanisms that allow us to do that, overcome those barriers and continue to do trade, recruit people, find the talent that we need to grow our businesses coming up. So collaboration and people, and then finally, before I finish this introduction, this idea of what hasn't changed. To me, that question is obvious. What hasn't changed is the real stuff. It's the basis of the language services industry. It is a global, multilingual, multinational business where work, people, ideas, collaborations move freely across the borders. This is something that, you know, we very keenly feel in the UK, in that I have yet to meet a language services person who actually voted for Brexit. You know, we are inherently in this global business with the EU. The language service companies in the UK, previously doing trade with the EU, are still doing trade with the EU, are desperate to keep that trade, those collaborations, those activities, those partnerships going, so that we're able to offer a continued service to our UK and non-UK based clients. And this is the best thing about, of course, being in this industry, in that we genuinely need to, and we genuinely want to work together cross-border and cross services. So essentially, if we go back to this idea of, is this a thing? For me, doing business with the UK post-Brexit is not really about doing business with the UK post-Brexit. It's purely about doing business. But what Brexit has highlighted are gaps or barriers or issues in the way that we've worked, especially around the red tape, that were already there, but we didn't really recognize them. We really didn't perhaps necessarily always comply with them fully. We've always worked with the US. We've always worked with, you know, very restrictive business environments like China. We got around that red tape. Brexit, because it's not a barrier that's always been there, it's a barrier that's gone up, has forced us to look at elements and try and figure out, what on earth are we going to do with that? What's the answer to that? And so on. So with Brexit, we've been digging a lot more as to, you know, how does the language services industry need to comply? How do language service companies need to change the way that they do business to work cross-border outside of the EU? So a lot of the questions, a lot of the barriers that we're now seeing with Brexit are actually barriers that probably have always been there with other markets. We just haven't been necessarily perhaps sufficiently aware of them. And that's a Brexit effect, I think, that we have seen in the language services industry, especially in Europe. And that's a good thing, that instead of just coasting along saying data protection, blah, blah, red tape, this and that, blah, blah. We're actually actively taking an interest in doing our business as sustainably, as safely as we can to protect our people and protect our clients' data. So that was my intro. I've seen some webinar chat messages going on. We've got the Q&A panel open. We'd love to hear your comments. We'd love to hear your questions. And I've got a couple of questions that I am desperate also to ask you. So let me just stop sharing my screen. And maybe, Anu, we could start with a couple of questions with you, and then John can pipe up with questions and comments from the webinar chat. And please, let's, we've got a small group here, so I think it would be really great to have a conversation as well with those of you who've got cross-border trade and services. So Anu, you already told us that you manage a business that is headquartered in the UK, but you've got staff in 4 European countries. And that was already the case before Brexit. So you've had this transition through Brexit. You're also an Elia board member, so you speak to business owners and managers, both in the UK and in the EU on a daily basis. In your experience, so what would you say, what are the main themes that come up for discussion around people, movement of people, recruitment, collaboration, challenges around Brexit? Or actually, do they have anything to do with Brexit and cross-border trade with the UK or the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think you were very right when you said that actually a lot of it is perception and not the reality. I mean, I can't say that it has been a huge change for Sandberg as a company in terms of business. Definitely not the external business that shows to our customers. A lot of the changes have been more to do with our internal way of hiring staff and all that. The VAT questions obviously came up immediately at the time, but they've now been sorted, like you said, and there is now data from the sources like the ATC if you want to dig deep into what's what. The one thing that we have noticed recently, which is a bit problematic for us, is bank charges. Now that the UK is not part of the EU anymore, we find that it's much more expensive to handle payments, receiving payments from the EU clients, but also paying our suppliers in the EU. So that's an area where it'd be fantastic to see some solutions, somebody providing some new way of banking with less strict fees. Yeah.
Yeah. What about your staff? What about your people?
Yeah.
What were your drivers and motivations to set up in 4 countries to start with? And has that landscape changed?
I would say that our drivers have always been the same. I think they're the same for all of us here. It's to be where the talent is. And if you have a business model where you hire that talent in-house, then you obviously have to set up some sort of operations. That's one thing. Obviously, affordable cost base is another one. That's why many of us look for offshoring solutions or something. So both of those have always been a concern for us. So the reason why we have talent, in-house talent in the Nordic countries is obviously not the cost base, but it's the fact that that's where the people are. We need linguistic in-house staff. That's part of our business model, and it tends to reside in the Nordic countries. Before Brexit, it was quite easy to attract that talent to move to the UK. Who doesn't want to live a couple of years in London when they are young and free? But even before Brexit, a lot of those people, they came to the UK for a while, but the understanding was always that they might want to go back home one day. And we didn't want to lose them at that point. So we always had a system where they could go back home and continue to be our employees. Yeah, that did change with Brexit. It is now much more costly for a UK company to hire an EU citizen. It's also a red tape process. You have to apply to be a sponsor. You have to be approved to be a sponsor. So that process costs you money. You get this overall license that allows you to be a sponsor first. And then when you have individuals that you want to bring over to the UK, then you have to apply for a specific sponsorship for those individuals. And there's a cost attached to that as well. So I have to say, I mean, sometimes it's difficult to know what was Brexit and what was COVID because they coincided. But during that period of a couple of years, I would say that, yeah, the interest of applicants to move to the UK just dropped to zero.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to come. Everybody was worried. And like you said, like your own story, we had a lot of our staff who wanted to go back home to their Nordic country around the time as well, because they didn't like the insecurity of having a future in the UK. Because in those days, like you said, a lot of the questions were unanswered and nobody quite knew how things would turn out. So our staff base in the UK went down and our staff numbers outside of the UK went up around that time.
Yeah.
And then we had those COVID years when you literally couldn't bring anybody to the country anyway because of COVID rules. So you ended up hiring people who started as remote workers working from home anyway because of COVID. And then, of course, for many of us, I guess that practice has stayed because we set up those systems and they worked. So why not continue with those systems now?
Yeah.
But the practical results for Sandberg were that, you know, we had a big headquarters here in the south of England, you know, a big office building where we had a lot of staff under one roof. And one of the results, combined Brexit and COVID, was that we closed that office. So we no longer have a big base, a building where we could have host big meetings or trainings or client events or anything. So we are much more dispersed now and with just small offices here and there.
Yeah. Sandberg's business model has in the past been very heavily focused around working with other language service companies. So you've got clients, you know, several hundred of them, language service company clients, both in the UK, in the EU and globally. So you've got, as a company, you've got a fairly unique view of how language service companies react to business challenges like the Brexit and of course COVID as well. Have you seen anything in terms of day-to-day business in practical terms? How has Brexit changed doing business in the language services space?
You know, I can't really say that I have, and I'm sure after this webinar I'll think of something, but I can't say that I have seen any one sweeping thing. When you were talking about the GDPR, and I was thinking about, you know, what did we do differently about GDPR? We didn't really, I mean, we decided to keep our data center in the EU because we had it in the EU anyway, even before Brexit. So our servers and the whole thing is set up in the Netherlands. And we decided to keep it there because we felt that it was easier to explain to UK clients and UK collaborators that we have a data center in the EU than to try to do it the other way around and explain. And also because it was already there, so we didn't have to move anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I really, like I said, the VAT rules were the big pain for a while. But once they were sorted, I can't think of anything else major. I mean, because we don't send anything physical. Like you said, there are no goods or physical things that need to cross borders. I mean, if there were, I know from my personal life, my personal experience, that even posting things, even sending documents in the post can be more labor intense now than it was before. You have to fill in forms and explain what the documents are, even if it was just a letter. So if you had to deliver paper copies of translations or certified versions or something like that, then that might be a bit more difficult, but that doesn't really happen. I sometimes have to send things to our accountants in the other countries and all that. And that's a bit of a faff to go to the post office and have to explain and fill in those forms. But no, not with our client relationships, no.
Yeah. Which is quite interesting, because there was that we had this expectation that this would be a massive deal, a massive problem for business, and a lot of uncertainty, certainly in the UK, and much of that hasn't actually materialized. Of course, we've seen the effect of COVID compound that, so we can't know how this business landscape would have looked like without it, and of course there's no point in speculating. But let's open the floor now to comments and conversation, discussion with the audience. We've got several here. Julia says we're based in Berlin and trying to work with UK clients. Had a couple of inquiries. Julia, if you want to share your questions or thoughts. Have we got, John, any questions here? Otherwise, I'm trying to.
No, there's nothing there. But so
No.
Yulia, if you want to actually come on screen and ask you questions, feel free. Just raise your hand. I'll give you permission. Or you could just type it in the Q&A.
Irene as well, you're in Athens, but have a limited company in the UK. It'd be really interesting to hear from you how you've seen it, what barriers you've seen or not.
We do have a question.
Which I don't know the answer to.
so for everyone else, the question from Sohrab is, could you say if bank fees are up more than 20% or 50% or more?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know that much detail. I just know that when I talk with our finance team, this comes up a lot, but I don't know the exact numbers.
Okay, and Janet has written in the chat, do you expect a shift in the languages needed as the UK market pivots to other markets? I worry about the decrease in learning of languages in UK.
Well, that's a very good question, Janet. A shift in the languages needed in the UK market is a really interesting one. It's not really one that we have been scoping out, and I'm not sure whether we're seeing that. Of course, the UK government's wish is to open up trade with global partners much more than in the past, such as India and the US and so on, South America, Africa, all of that. I would have thought that may change the commercial languages needed, but I'm not sure how Brexit related that is. I mean, as we have seen, there hasn't been a huge rush from global markets to make great trade deals with the UK. So that hasn't really materialized. And in terms of the decrease in learning of languages in the UK, yes, that was already happening. That's already been happening for the past 20 years in the UK, a very unfortunate trend. I think Brexit has accelerated that, because it's created this thought of an insular place where you don't actually have to be in a European community. So that is a major challenge for the UK, not just for the language services industry, for translation. It's for the UK's competitiveness in the global market, where we don't have people with language skills. That is already a challenge. We're still seeing the language learning going down in our space. We're seeing that in practice with UK universities, many of which have closed down their translation departments over the past couple of years. Just in the past year, we've had 2 or 3 translation departments closing down permanently because they are not seen as well, basically it's about money, so they're not bringing in the money. what we've also seen is a shift in terms of translation students. There's a huge shift going on at the moment with UK domestic versus overseas students. So where in the past there were a lot of European students studying translation studies in the UK, there's very few of them now. So essentially now it's UK domestic students and students from outside of the EU, so Asia, for example, and the number of UK students seems to be going down. So yes, this is a trend that Brexit has accelerated, I think. But it's good for language service companies outside of the UK, because
We'll need you.
We'll need you. Yep.
I mean, think about it.
UK will need you.
Yeah, exactly. If we don't have any linguists in this country anymore being trained to the level that we are used to, and it's made very difficult for us to hire them from the European countries, then, you know, what does it mean for the future profile of a UK language service provider company? What kind of people will be working in our companies in the future?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Oh, there we go. Elia has finally come around. I haven't actually seen any barriers yet, but I think it's just because my experience is so limited. But generally, do UK companies prefer working with local providers?
Well, that is another good question. And that's something that we've been trying to figure out with ATC member companies for a few years now, whether in our global world, whether buying local is still a thing. And I would say that in the UK, it most definitely still is. We've got a lot of, the ATC has got a lot of language service company members across the UK who primarily get their work from local businesses. The UK, if we don't talk about just the language services industry now, but the UK's business landscape is very traditional, shall I say. There are a lot of small businesses. SMEs make up, I think, is nearly 99% of the UK's businesses. So there's a lot of small businesses, traditional businesses, of course, also those large multinational enterprises and so on, primarily in London, of course. But there's a lot of really small SME companies who work with local language services providers. And that's one of the reasons why also in the UK, perhaps much more than in most European countries, there are a lot of small language service companies as well.
Do you think the reason for that, Raisa, is that British people are still worried about having to speak some other language?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Saurabh has another question. Is it more difficult for EU businesses to establish a UK base than before?
Yes, it is. And the same goes for UK businesses establishing a base in the EU. If by base we mean a company. So I can't remember now what the exact rules are, but both in the EU and in the UK, to establish a limited company, at least one of the directors, I think, has to be resident in that country. So you wouldn't be able to establish a company in another country without having a director level person in that country. That's certainly something that we were looking at from the UK to the EU, which is why collaboration is a no-brainer there. So I suppose from a cross-border trade point of view, it's worth spending a little bit of time trying to figure out, do you actually need to have a legal entity? Do you need to have a company in the other country, or can you do your trade through other means? And of course, you don't need to be in that country to invoice clients in that country. And there are other mechanisms as well that you can use to get around that. But yes, there is a barrier in terms of setting up a legal entity in the UK, and the same for UK companies in the EU as well.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay. With that, we're actually just about on time. Raisa, thank you very much. Anu,
My pleasure.
thank you. I'm glad you both could join us. And to everyone else, I wish you a good day, good evening, and we hope to see you at another Focus Forward event. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks for joining.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.